Originally, in the last meeting, I offered to give a talk about sort of how in one of our products we've combined Node.js Express and the Mongo database to make a sort of like lightweight API. A bunch of people expressed interest in that. And then a bunch of people expressed interest in the HTML5 Canvas element, and somehow someone convinced me to add 4 things, each of which could probably be its own talk, into one talk. So just as sort of just so you know, this is a very high level, like sort of grazing through all of these topics. But if someone is really interested in something, or especially if you have experience with one of the things I'm going over and have like a story to share, or about how you tried it out, or how something didn't work, or something like that, I would say these are all like technologies that are still kind of like up and coming. They're stable, but not widely deployed anywhere. So especially if you've like actually deployed a system using this, I would love to hear about it. And so if you have questions or stuff, just stop me anytime. Let's see, could I get a raise of hands for people who've heard of Node.js before? Everybody. Express? Half people? Okay, awesome. And then MongoDB, probably most people, that's pretty popular. All right, awesome. So I'm Michael Holroyd. I work at Arqball and also am a founder of Meetup, but all the stuff I'm going to show you today is from Arqball. So let's get started. So for the people who didn't raise their hand on any of these, maybe there's someone in the back who's like, oh my god, what's about to happen? What is all this stuff? So Node.js is a server-side, event-driven JavaScript framework, basically, or engine, you can even say. It basically uses the V8 engine from that Google has developed to run stuff on your servers. So while even a few years ago you would traditionally think of JavaScript as something that you only run in a browser on the client side, it's basically a way of taking that same code that you're used to and pulling it into your backend, where it actually turns out to be a very powerful framework that I'll talk about some. Express is a very minimalistic web framework for Node.js. So it's basically like simplifies the tasks of pushing GET requests, taking GET requests in, pushing data back out to a browser or even just an API. And then MongoDB is it's a NoSQL database, so a schemaless document database. All right, so what I'm going to talk about is one particular system we've built, and so I'm going to give you sort of some of our rationale for why we picked these particular tools. So why Node.js? I guess reason number one is JavaScript, right? We're all here because we're interested in JavaScript. And so this is a way to make all of your code base in JavaScript, if that's something that you think is valuable to have one consistent language across your entire framework. One of the other big perks of Node.js is that it has a non-blocking model. So whereas in sort of a typical programming language, you might like request something from the database and then your program blocks waiting for that information from the database. In Node.js, you basically ship that and forget about it until it comes back as an event. And so what this gets you is that time that you might be spending snoozing in the original single-threaded program. Now you have other work that can get done until that event sort of percolates to the top and you get back to it. And so as opposed to having sort of a multi-threaded framework where you have lots of threads all running because you're afraid some of them are going to be like sleeping half of the time, this is a way of getting a lot of work done on a single thread. The other thing that's really awesome about Node.js, if you haven't used it before, is that NPM is the package management system, and it's really an exceptional package management system. I know that sounds weird, but if you're used to like having troubles getting libraries to integrate with your stuff, or you're used to having like a hard time getting set up, NPM is a very, very awesome tool that accompanies Node.js. So let me show you, is this readable? No. No. Is it actually not readable? This may be a challenge to make bigger unless I copy and paste this all over the place. Let me try to copy this all over the place. We'll take a.
Can you just command plus?
Unfortunately, the thing that I'm using, it kind of like maxes out at a certain size for the slide. Can't get bigger. All right, so this is a new presentation framework for me, so I'm learning all of the woes about it. This, however, I can control plus into infinity. Yeah.
Very readable.
Very readable. Let's see. All right, so this is going to be really lame when I copy paste all the time, but bear with me. So this is what your typical sort of absolute hello world looks like in Node.js, if you haven't seen something like this before. So require is sort of a typical, this is how you get stuff that you've said, it comes with this package using the package manager. So HTTP is like the bare minimum HTTP back and forth protocol. And so one of the things it can let you do is create a server. And so in this server, you basically pass to the server a function that takes in requests and gives back responses. And so in this case, we're doing like the simplest thing possible. We put in the header 200, say it's plain text, and then we put in the body hello world. And then this HTTP server object, you can basically call .listenOn to have this thing listen on some port. So any questions about like what Node.js is? I think everyone raised their hands. They've probably seen this before, but if anyone's like wants to know more about why you would use this or something. Okay, awesome. All right, so that's sort of the minimalistic thing. And so that's what Node.js gets you. And now you might ask, okay, well, what is Express? Why would we use Express? Basically, Express handles like the common server patterns, right? So instead of like having to always write to the header the 200 and that this is plain text or HTML or something, which gets very, very obnoxious, Express sort of handles all of that for you. There are a bunch of other frameworks as well for Node.js. So just like in the Ruby world, if people know Ruby, where you have sort of like heavyweight stuff like Rails, you have lightweight stuff like Sinatra, Express is trying to fill that lightweight space. So if you don't want something that has a bunch of extra complication to it, I mean, in this case we were trying to write a short, really snappy API, and so we really didn't need like models in certain places, authentication in other places. We didn't need all these tools. The other nice thing that Express does is it handles middleware, basically like passing your request through a bunch of middleware to attach stuff to them before you ship it out. And I'll show you why that's useful as well. So, so here is the exact same web server in Express. Some line numbers. So basically here you make an Express object, you create an app in quotation marks, you just think of it as a server. And you can see now that you can do stuff like use, you can use typical HTTP verbs like get, post, etc., and then give it a route. And this takes care of setting up, basically taking incoming requests, figuring out which route they match, and then running the function that you handed. And so in the same way, you give it a request and response, we say just response.send hello world, and Express will figure out that this is raw text. Typically it'll be HTML, or maybe it'll be JSON. And then same thing over here, you do opt.listen. And so, yeah, like I said. So I was talking about middleware. This is going to be a little bigger. I don't know, who was at the talk last month? Raise of hands, some people. So last month we talked about, I kind of pulled this up at the last minute. That's probably big enough, yeah. Basically we talked about cores, which is cross-origin request sharing? Resource sharing. And so basically what this lets you do, what Express lets you do is hand it a function. So this function takes the exact same request as always. It has a response object, and it also has the next call. And so basically you give it a list of things you want it to do to each response as it comes in, and it'll do each one. So this is for giving it all of the course headers that you need. So in this case, it's just like access control, allow origin, saying, hey, what's that?
Could you make that bigger, please?
Bigger, yeah.
That's good.
That's good right there. So basically this is attaching a bunch of headers to the response. And then down here, I don't know who remembers the options verb, but basically there's a new HTTP verb, which is options, which is saying like, hey, do you support cores? And the correct response to that, if you do, is to send back a 200 and be like, yeah, I do, and here's the headers. So basically this function by itself takes care of all of the core stuff that you need. And then passes it off to the next handler, which might be your actual app, or it might be like yet another piece of middleware. And the way you set this up is that app from before, you just call configure on it. And so in this case, I'm saying like, hey, every single thing that comes in, use this default logging mechanism to log all the stuff, and then also use this allow cross-domain call so that I can feed stuff to other servers and make like image data accessible to people, etc. Any questions about why Express is cool? Has anyone used anything other than Express? Like, there's some heavyweight alternatives that I have not used, but some people might know something about.
I know in one of the previous meetings, there was talk about some of the other ones, or you stated a computer-long presentation.
Yeah, so like, I guess what this doesn't get you that might be something you want is the typical like MVC framework. So I know there are alternatives to this that like, enforce the MVC separation, which a lot of people like. preventing themselves from making stupid mistakes / helping a team like organize their thoughts. In this case, like small API, we decided it was overkill. All right, so that's basically Express in a nutshell. So why MongoDB? So I think there was a bunch of people expressed interest in talking about NoSQL stuff as well, which like is definitely a whole talk unto itself. So I don't want to get into a huge argument about like whether NoSQL is worth anything or not. Ron's not here, so at least it's not going to be like pure, MySQL versus NoSQL debate. The reason I really like MongoDB, actually, I'm a big fan, and the reason is that it stores just like straight JSON objects, which is exactly what you're passing around already in JavaScript. And because of that, it integrates really, really nicely with Node.js. I mean, there's basically no transformation between exactly what came out of your database and exactly what you're using in your program. And so this is a very, very, this is really, really very nice, actually, to have that. And the other advantage of having a schemaless model is really just that you don't have to think about the schema ahead of time. So you might call this, some people call this a benefit, some people would say this is a negative because you're not putting thought into it before. But something we found is like, oh, all of a sudden, 3 weeks later, you realize, oh, we are going to add Facebook login, and we didn't think we had to. Now we need to add some stuff. Instead of having some migration progress and like having to move a bunch of tables back and forth, you basically just start adding that to your JSON objects, and then your code says like, hey, do you have this Facebook information? If yes, go down this path. If not, go down some other path. So let me show you a little bit.
I bet you think about your schema.
Oh, of course we think about it.
You mean it's easy to...
It's easy to grow. It's very natural to build your schema, and it's also very natural to sort of have like nested objects. So one of the big arguments for document-based stuff is like, imagine you need to put a bunch of structured data in your database, but like none of it's the same. So it's all products that you're selling, but like some of them have prices, but then some of them have like a different price depending on whether it's small, medium, large, blah blah blah. And so instead of having to like have all these tables that have links to whether this is relevant or not, or having like a long line of binary decisions, you can kind of add these more naturally as like a hierarchical object, I think anyway. Some people would disagree. So let me show you a little bit about the MongoDB and how this looks in practice. And again, this is specifically how it looks in practice in Node.js, which is a lot of building on each other. Still legible?
Still. Okay.
All right, sweet. So Node.js has a native Mongo client that you just grab using the package manager, so there's like zero setup, which is nice. Basically the way you do it is you have this Mongo object, you say connect, and you give it this function, which is everything that's going to happen after you're connected to the database. So again, if you're not used to this model, each one of these is like non-blocking. So of course, connecting to the database requires some like authentication, And so instead of blocking while that happens, you basically pass it a function and you're saying like, hey, when you are connected to the database, do this next thing. Similarly here, so like here, oh, sorry, that's an example. So this is saying, in the Express, it's saying, hey, here's an API call we're gonna make, /firehose. This is just gonna return like everything in this database as an example. And then this call, db.collections, this is saying, out of the twists collection, so this comes from the app focus twist, which I should have described at the beginning, but I'll describe for the next section when it's more relevant. So twists are the objects that we're interested in, and there's a database of twists. And so you basically pass it a function saying like, hey, once you've tapped into this collection, from this collection, find everything. So if you're not used to MongoDB, you basically pass it a JSON object that has a specification for what you're looking for. And the empty object just says match everything. I'll show some more examples in a minute.
And you might say, collection is roughly like a table in a SQL.
Yeah, collection is like a table, except that it's not structured. It's basically just a big set of JSON objects. So here is find everything, sort it in reverse order by created at. And then, so this, obviously these aren't like each firing off a call, right? This is setting up some statement that you're going to actually call. And so you can get it in a bunch of formats. You can get it as an iterator if you have like tons of data and might want to bail out early. In this case, I want it as an array. And so basically once you've made that call and you've stuffed it all into an array, call this next function. And now, my server's running off doing other work until that request is complete, which takes a long time because this is like the whole database. And then once you have it, in this case it's like super stupid API, it just takes the entire array of everything in the database and dumps it. And so
is the to-array, if you didn't call it, would you be getting a cursor?
You have to call something here. You can do to-cursor or to-array.
Okay.
there's some other options too, depending on how you want to interact with your data set.
So seeing this, I have a question now. How is debugging support for Node.js? Because we just have like 5 callbacks right there.
Yeah. So
there's
I'm
no way like a single step debugger that acts like it's calling them all in a row, or acts like it's blocking.
That's a great question. So I'm a big believer in the like printf transform for debugging, which maybe makes me sort of like boring old school. Certainly you can do, there is like a step-by-step debugger. I don't know what exactly, basically you have this problem where you have events percolating at the top, right? And so this thing's single-threaded, so you're not going to get like crazy multi-threading problems, but like when you're trying to debug something, you basically just set your breakpoints intelligently, because if you just step-by-step, you're going to be doing everyone's work if you have multiple requests coming in or something. But there is a step-by-step thing. It basically there's a REPL that you can tap into and go step-by-step.
This is also where projects like Lighttable are becoming interesting to people too, because Lighttable has no integration now where you can actually, inspect as the process is running what the values of objects are. But it's similar to like the slime interaction.
Yeah, that's really nice, because I find the REPL super awkward, because like inevitably you have to like print data, but your data is like never in a convenient form to print, and so yeah, I haven't used Lighttable much, but it seems like.
Have you been using Lighttable?
No, I've only played with it long enough to get it up and running and get an idea of how it would work. I've actually been using.
Well, after you can do the next.
Get your presentation ready. You're up next.
After 6 years of using Vim, I actually switched to Emacs specifically to get slime for this area.
Yeah.
So.
Nice.
Yay, next.
Okay, that debate we're not having. We can have debates about Mongo before we have that debate. So this is basically this in some sense, like without a little bit of boilerplate, this is an entire app right here, right? It's a boring app that does nothing but pulls something out, the entire database out, and spits it back to you. But this 10 lines of code is basically like one a very, very small API. So does anyone have any questions about like kind of what Mongo does, or like how Mongo works, before I show
Just
other stuff? Yeah.
very briefly, not to tap now the conversation, but is there a resource online I can see stuff like this that I can play with?
There are a bunch of really good tutorials for Mongo. I don't know that I might at the end of the presentation have a couple of links to good tutorials. I can't remember.
Business partner and I, we've been using not the Node.js frame, we've been using the Perl interpreter that's connecting. We've run into some problems with how it wants to interpret arrays and things like that. I'm not really pleased with it.
Gotcha. This is connecting Perl
Well,
and
the fact
Mongo.
that this is Perl connected to Mongo,
I
and
see.
looking at this, it sounds like sticking with the JSON is a much more pure way of doing it.
I would say so. I mean, it's so natural.
I just don't
so,
like the idea of having something in between me and what I'm working with, that it's like, you have to put it in their language, and then it tries to interpret it, and there's some
Exactly.
glitches with it.
Well, unfortunately, Perl's Mongo driver is really primitive. It's not, they try to Perlify it as opposed to just accepting that JSON
Yeah.
is JSON.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's what we're running into, is like if you put a single element in an array, you actually have to kind of declare it as a string in a way. It's weird. It's like, well, what if I only have one element, but I need element 0?
Yeah, so my other startup,
its hands up.
Meetup, we do everything in Scala, and so of course it's like super strongly typed, which drives me insane because I'm really used to JavaScript, where I can just like
Yeah, exactly.
throw stuff around really easily.
Can I ask you another question real quick?
Yeah.
Although you already switched.
I can.
It's okay though.
Yeah.
I was trying to remember, because I haven't looked at Express for a long time, but that app-get, that sort of registers it to like take the callback, right?
Exactly.
So like,
So somewhere down here,
so
there's like an app.listen, basically, where
Right.
you like give it a port number or something like that.
so if you turn the auto reconnect to false, then like a long time could happen before you get the request, and you just like lose the connection, I assume.
Yeah, so for some historical reason, by default, so typically the way you do this is you don't want to reconnect to the database for every single API call, right? If you have a ton of traffic, you connect once and just leave your server running for as long as you can keep the database up. And so you basically have the option of either just auto reconnecting and trying the same thing again, and alternatively, you can explicitly handle disconnections. So you can imagine if you're doing some like banking transaction, you don't just necessarily want to auto reconnect and then try to keep doing the same transaction. You might need to like bail out and do something different.
Right.
Did that answer your question? Or?
Yeah, I was just kind of curious, like, making sure I understood the logic. That sounds a little bit.
Yeah, there are a ton of options to pass to this. This is just what we're using in particular. This is like real code that we're actually using. So if you want to go slam our servers, just go /firehose for, you know, write a bot to go /firehose forever, and you'll definitely rack up some traffic on our website.
This is being videotaped.
It is, it's true. I might have to secure this actually after this talk. I think they even have this up.
Those trade secrets.
We didn't tell you something's actually a bot that gets down.
Yeah, here we go. Here's the real deal. Let's see if it's, that's how long dumping the whole database takes.
There's somebody in China.
We'll never finish
working
printing
on
this.
this.
Yeah, hopefully this isn't live. Okay, so here's a little, sorry, was someone gonna?
Yeah. So this question made me think about that code, like, if apt-get registers a path, shouldn't the connection be inside its callback, right?
That would make it connect every single time you got a request, instead of, say, have a connection sitting around ready to be used when we
But instead it's...
So the typical model that I use at least is basically just wrap the entire program in a database connection. Because in practice, I don't usually need to handle, like the database doesn't go down very often, right? This is like a bad event when it does. And so in practice, I basically just connect at the top, and then the entire rest of the program is inside of that callback. So in that sense, my program, when I turn it on, it actually does block, because there's no other function to run until that database connection happens.
I see.
Yeah, but again, that's application specific. You might have an application where database work is rare, and you don't want to stay connected to the database all the time. You might actually connect inside of a callback. Yep.
Did you look at other Mongo drivers?
So for Node.js, I don't think there's any reason to use anything but the native driver. It's fully featured, and it's like supported by the Mongo team. So yeah, I think there was before
Mongoose or something like that a while back.
Oh yeah, sorry. So Mongoose it's not really a driver. So what Mongoose is basically an ODM, so like object to data mapping thing. And so I actually use that on a different project. And so Mongoose is nice if you're basically you need to do more complicated stuff on your objects. So what Mongo returns, of course, is like JSON. So it's really just data. There's no functions that you can do on the data. So if you have the notion of an account, for example, you might want to pull that account, but you might wish that account had functions on it, like, upgrade my account or something. And so this is what Mongoose provides. It basically provides a way of pulling stuff out of the database, but having functions on it, and then being able to call like .save when you're done to actually push stuff back to the database. So for a more complicated application, I would actually recommend Mongoose. I'm glad you brought that up. This is sort of like using the raw to the metal version for when it's really just like data moving around.
So, what do we do when we live in a node world and we have long-running, computationally intensive tasks?
You put them in other processes and then call them in a non-blocking function, usually. So as a great example, we have a process that I really should have described my apps before I started this talk. So Focus Twist is sort of think of it for right now like a photo sharing app. And one of the things that it does is that it updates some global feed all day. So it's always looking for things that are cool, don't have curse words in them, and are worthy to be put in the feed. And that actually runs as a separate process. And so it is it's a dedicated thread that just sits there doing long-running work all the time. And if I wanted to call those, I would actually call them I would start that process up from inside of one of my callbacks. So this is actually a good point. I mean, Node.js in general, you can't afford to have any, since it's single-threaded and it's by design non-blocking, you can't afford to have any long-running, computationally intensive task anywhere in your Node.js program, really. So if you want, because it'll lock the thread, right? While it's doing work, that thread locks. So if you want to do that, you basically start another thread, which is, it's what you want to do anyway, right? You basically want that running in some separate thread. There are tools to make that easier. So if you have a lot of concurrent work, there are stuff you can get out of the package manager to make that easier, but I have not used it yet. All right, so let's see. So this is an example of a little bit more complicated use of MongoDB for people who kind of want to see what the syntax looks like. The syntax is a little funky in my opinion. It takes a while to get used to. So in this example, what this is trying to do, it's basically, we have people who are, again, like I mentioned, a photo sharing app. People are posting photos, and then finally someone shares one of their photos on Twitter, all from the same user. So suppose you want to back propagate all of that information, so you know now that I have their Twitter handle, let me update all the other ones. And so the way that you do this here, you call this dd.twists. Twist again is that collection. So you call .aggregate, and what you're telling this is you think of this as a group by, like in standard SQL. So I'm going to group everything based on this identifier, and I'm going to name that _ID. So one of the quirks of Mongo is that every single element has to have a unique, well not unique, but it has to have an _ID field that basically is like the unique, sorry, not just the thing that defines that element. And then we basically just like add up how many things they've made, and we get their Twitter handle. Max here is just to prevent like empty string from becoming the thing on top. And then once you have this result, it's all packed into R. So we say, hey, r.result, I'm going to map each one of these objects, O for object. I'm going to map each one of these objects. If it has a Twitter handle, I'm going to go update the database saying like, grab this thing's ID and update it with the new Twitter handle. And so this chunk of code, pretty small and compact. I feel like the syntax is a little funky, but pretty small and compact way to do that operation of grab stuff out of the database and then go and update everybody's info. Any questions about this code chunk? All right, so that's like the super fast version of Mongo. One thing you might be wondering about is what about the HTML? So I haven't showed any HTML yet, and in fact, most of the stuff I've been working on doesn't have any front-facing HTML. But if you're trying to like make some small web app that also has a small API, this is probably something you worry about. So there are a zillion templating languages, as I'm sure everyone knows. In sort of keeping with this talk with a bunch of like super minimalistic stuff, one that I like a lot is Mustache.js. So Mustache.js is basically, it's like a very minimalistic templating framework for HTML. Not even HTML, I should say. It's really for anything, but I'll show you how to use it for HTML. And so what you do is you pass it a string that has these double braces around variable names, basically, and then you pass in this view object. What's nice about it is that variable names can be much more complicated things, right? They can be functions. They can be arrays, in which case you can iterate over a thing of arrays. The one thing Mustache does not let you do is do like anything at all intelligent in your views. And I actually think this is kind of a good thing. It basically forces you to push any thinking, like even if you want to format a date, for example, that's very inconvenient to do in Mustache, and it forces you to do it on your server side, which I kind of like as a way of like making sure that all interesting thinking happens on the server, and this really just becomes like pushing a view out. And so this is sort of like the whole thing here. Let me try to show you. Rather than processing strings every single time, typically you compile that string, and so then you just have like one JavaScript function that you pass the view parameter to, and it basically like spits out the correct string. So here's an example where I have this thing called mustache twist. I've compiled some function, twist.html. Twist.html has a bunch of these curly brackets in it where I want to input some data. So here's an example again. Here's app.get. You can see in this case I've attached some parameter to it. So this will be like slash, the ID of your twist. I go to the twist collections. I find the twist that has the same ID as the thing that you typed in here. This is kind of silly. There's a find one operation. This is actually like, I simplified this code and forgot about this. But here in this case, I'm getting like the next object in case I was doing this over a loop. And then I set up this view variable that basically has like the server, the twist ID, created at, I think I said next time if you have to do with anything with dates, moment is awesome. So if you haven't used moment.js, check it out. And then the person's Twitter handle. And then I pass this off to the view. And I guess I can show you this page since I'm on the internet here. Have like one of these things queued up for your grab. All right. Anyway, this is a page that actually isn't fed, but you get the idea. Basically, this thing is like this is one of the twists, which is one of these refocusable images, which I'll tell you about in a minute here when I talk about Canvas stuff.
Is that the new camera that does that multi-focus?
It is not. It is a super cheap version of it, in fact.
I don't know. The Litro.
Yeah, it's this Litro camera right here.
Yeah,
but
Litro, is that it?
Yeah. Except for that one Engadget guy who decided it was going to be called Litro. Everyone else calls it Litro, including the owners. So I defer to him, although a lot of people call it Litro now. In terms of feeding static stuff, feeding static files is just like another piece of middleware, right? So in this case, express.static. Grab everything out of the public folder, and if I find that first, just feed the raw stuff. So for images and etc. This is how you set this up. Let's just say like one word about deploying. Node.js plays very friendly with Heroku, and Heroku has an add-on for MongoLab, which is basically a hosted Mongo database. And you can do both for free while you're developing. So on Heroku, the way they get you is that if you don't pay anything, your process goes to sleep. If you don't like ping it every hour or so. So either you can kind of be a jerk and like set the process to ping it every 30 minutes, or you can upgrade and then it's $34.50 a month to run one sort of Heroku dyno, which is their notion of like a CPU. And then MongoLab, the free starter plan is up to 500 megabytes, and then it's like $10 a month for 20 gigabytes. It sort of goes up naturally.
Where are these hosted?
What's that?
Where are they hosted?
So in this case, they're both hosted on Amazon. So basically what's going on, basically what's going on is Heroku is handling all the provisioning of like EC2 instances for you, and then MongoLab has like a bunch of big
So it's all
EC2
part of the
machines, and
cloud.
they're giving you little like chunks of their machine basically. So there's a little bit of a performance concern. Like if you have a really performance critical application, you want to look into this a little more carefully. But it works great for like simple small APIs that are mostly like read heavy stuff. Oh yeah, in fact, quick performance tests. Like we've done some load testing, and this setup with basically the 3450 plus the free Mongo plan can handle something like 1,200 users and like 500 hits a second for if you're doing mostly like read heavy work. And so this, hopefully, for many applications, this covers kind of your API needs if it's not like a real-time kind of thing. All right, sweet. So that is the first talk, if that's believable. The second one will be shorter. Don't worry if everyone's like glazing over. I'm going to put this online. There's a bunch of links to stuff I talked about. So does anyone have any questions about that stack? Has anyone used anything other than what I talked about, or has experience with like alternatives?
What does your API do?
So during the next talk I'll describe these two apps. Maybe I should do these in another order or something.
I'm just gonna say I was kind of surprised to hear that anyone's having a problem with a Mongo driver. Because like one of the good things about Tengen, and one of the bad things is they have a lot of money and they do a lot of advertising and whatever.
Yep.
It's like founded by one of the guys who, it's like the DoubleClick. Anyway, people have a lot of money and a lot of connections. One of the good things is they hire people to work on drivers like full time and manage the mailing list and stuff. So I've never heard of anyone having. I'm surprised. Most major languages, including Perl, have very solid drivers. Right. So, but because I was talking to I went to MongoDC a couple of years ago, and talking to Dwight Merriman, like the CEO dude, and he's like, what we're trying to do is we're trying to make Mongo the easiest NoSQL database to get started with.
I would say they've succeeded at that.
They succeeded at that.
Yeah. They've made it very. It's really. Maybe it's kind of hard to describe without showing it. But if you like go to these 4 websites at the top here, you click on documentation and open up a text editor. You'll have a small API. Putting stuff in your database and pulling it out in like less than an hour for sure if you just like sit down and crush it. So they made it really, really easy to get started, which is awesome for people who are like prototyping stuff. Yeah.
Well, they mentioned, where I found out about it was a book called, I think it's 7 Databases in 7 Days. And it was basically comparing, the SQL and non-SQL, and Mongo was one of them. And after reading them all, the Mongo was just like, that's the direction I want to go.
Yeah.
We're just getting started with this.
I'll put on Ron's hat and say like, SQL is very powerful and like joins are much, much faster than sort of their naive equivalent in Mongo. So if you're going to, I think there are a lot of kind of applications where you can make it really fast in Mongo, but there are sort of some complicated examples where you'll run into performance walls if you really need to do like complicated joins. So some other time.
I just-
we'll-
If you use MongoDB as a relational database, you're screwed.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Trying to use MongoDB as a
It's not
relational
designed for
database
that,
is insane.
I just
so-
need fast lookups based upon user, you know, I do
Yeah, if you're pulling
websites.
IDs, if you're querying it by
I
ID
do
all the time,
websites for car
these are
dealers,
all
and we're getting ready
fast.
to deploy a national system where I'm gonna have sliders saying, move my year choices from here to here, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I need, and as soon as they let off the mouse, I want the screen loading with what they've selected. And, you know, I don't need a bunch of, you know, handshaking database connections each time, you know what I mean, like with MySQL, which, and when we ran some test results, Mongo was just like instant, it was like,
Yeah. I will say, I mean, I think it's the case that basically like MySQL, it can be very, very fast if you optimize it correctly. So if you have the right indices and stuff, it'll be fast.
but we've got stuff where we do transactional stuff and we need the MySQL security and stability for that stuff. So that's not leaving anytime soon. But for this particular application, where I need lightning fast lookups, here's your stuff next. That's what I'm looking for that.
Gotcha. Well, run some experiments and make some plots and share it with us. I think everyone would love to see how that goes.
My buddy, he spends more time doing this, and he runs down to he's like timing this stuff. Well, this one did it in so many milliseconds. This one did it in, you know,
Yeah,
it's
man.
like
Start a blog. People love data. Like, there's not enough data on this stuff. It's really hard to be like, oh, well, for my application, like, am I going to run into a performance wall? You almost never know.
he
until
likes
you do
doing
it.
this stuff.
So it's quite a bit about years since I touched it, but I've also played around with, in Node, with chucking a bunch of data into MySQL, but then building a loose install index from the MySQL. And
That's also a way to make stuff extremely fast.
That was really fast.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think always keeping your stuff handy in memory is the way to make stuff really, really fast. So I don't think you're ever going to beat, ever going to beat like caching stuff or putting in something that's smart enough to cache stuff.
Talking about in terms of in-memory stuff, how do you compare MongoDB with something like Redis?
I don't think they're really comparable. I mean, it's really like, if you really need to store your stuff in the back end, you're in a different world from Redis in terms of performance. You could use them together. I don't know anyone who's done that, but I don't see any.
Designed kind of for different things, right?
What would you say Redis is for? Best case use?
Maybe someone who's used it would be better to speak.
Really good
about.
for anything where you can keep all your data in memory, and persistence isn't quite as crucial. So I've seen it used a lot for like queues and things like that, where you're pulling stuff in. I know Andrew Monoleni and Parsley use it for sort of all of their events initially come into a Redis server because it can pull in, they get a really deep queue, and then they persist it out to a different database.
Oh, okay.
Exactly. And so if you don't need those two things to be in sync all the time, and you can, like, if your server crashes, you can afford to lose whatever's sitting around in your Redis cache, then it's much faster when you're pulling it out of that Redis cache because it's in memory, like ready to go.
Did you have any problems with Express or Node or V8 or anything that made you ever maybe have second thoughts?
I really never hit any noteworthy snags. I mean, there's a little bit of a syntax learning curve just in terms of like coping with there being function calls and curly braces everywhere like mad, but that's JavaScript. That's not really Node in any sense.
I'm kind of wondering, so for the connection, so you're passing in the connection, right? So it's not like you have a scope problem. So you could pull that function out. Could you pull those functions out that you have nested and just?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you have something, any of those can be pulled out. Yeah, exactly. There's no scoping problem. So that for me, they're so short. Like if I can fit it on one of these slides at that zoom in, then I don't pull it out to a function. But that's just a code style thing. Some people probably prefer to have like a nice. You can imagine having a really nice, clean table of like routes and the functions they call that are all in one place, and then have the functions in other places if that fits your.
Were you thinking also about like the closures, like the memory, like the surrounding lexical scope, or?
Yeah, everything you did right there was just lots and lots of closures, right?
Yes, exactly.
So you try to not depend on that, right? I assume most of like the utility functions don't depend on that, like they pass in the database information, right?
Yeah, well, in some sense, it's in scope for all of those. So the way I typically do it, if all of these are sitting inside of some callback function, then that the DB object is basically like globally accessible inside of that. So that way I don't explicitly pass like DB into each one of those functions.
Yeah. I don't know how it gets in scope. So
Yeah,
just not enough of it.
Yeah, check it out. It'll make sense. There's possibly some magic happening with when you do that require at the top. That can basically do arbitrary work. So that might just put it in scope. So let me buzz onto these two apps. So basically, I'm going to talk about HTML5 Canvas. Again, sort of super high level quickly. So let me just start with like what is Canvas. I guess raise your hand if you've used Canvas element before. Okay, so like half the people, probably like the front end people versus the back end people. So basically, it's a rectangle you can draw stuff onto on a website, right? This is the purpose of Canvas. This is why it was designed. It's pretty well supported in basically all browsers. IE8 and earlier, you have to do like silly tricks to get it to cooperate. But it's a pretty well accepted standard now. It's not something you really have to like figure out how it's going to work in every single browser, which is really nice because there's a lot of display-related things that still don't behave like that even today. So roughly, I'm not even going to zoom in on this. Basically, how to draw, like you get a context out of the DOM for the Canvas element, and then you can make calls like dot draw line with like XY coordinates, dot draw ellipse, all this stuff. I would say realistically though, like this is the same as like trying to write PostScript by hand. Like it just doesn't make sense. Like there's no way, unless you're making like a cute game or something, you probably want to do something a little more powerful. On the other hand, I wanted to show a couple of ridiculous examples that use exactly this approach. So this is a Canvas element on the web running at like 60 frames per second.
Is that a 2D version or a 3D?
This is a 2D canvas. So I should say one thing you'll notice is that when you get a context, you always pass in the string 2D to let the browser know you're getting the 2D canvas. 3D canvas is like a work in progress, so that does not really exist yet. But you can see down the road, obviously, we'd like to have 3D canvases. So despite looking 3D, this is just very quickly drawing a bunch of 2D objects to the screen and then flashing the screen.
Does that use the video card?
Yeah, so this can be video accelerated, like in Chrome.
Was that?
Super fast. I think that was not actually, if I'm not mistaken. I'd have to check it out though.
3D stuff like sort of mimics OpenGL.
Yeah, so this isn't using like OpenGL. It's not using any 3D like rasterization stuff, but it's using hardware to help accelerate the 2D rendering. Which I think that's happening even on like this page here, right? And this is accelerated in that sense. Okay, so let me now finally, after all the setup, describe some of the stuff we've been working on. Yeah.
Just point later reference. I've been looking around for how to do better memory optimization using Canvas, because when I do like a multi-file select of a bunch of JPEG images, if they've got like a bunch of 5 meg images, Firefox goes Chrome does a little better, but I'm looking for any resource you might point me in the direction of that would help me to deal with that.
I really can't. You're definitely living, when you're using Canvas, you're living in like a constrained world. You really don't have the luxury of like being really particular about your memory management. So I would say JPEG Mini is a great tool for making smaller JPEGs.
I've kind of invented my own way of doing certain things and optimized some stuff just by seat of the pants, trying different things. And I've improved things significantly, but the whole idea of like destroying, creating, just doesn't seem to work. It's not accomplishing it. And I'm doing like memory monitoring, see how much RAM I'm using and stuff like that. And as I'm introducing stuff that's just like climbing through the roof, and Firefox especially likes to go through the roof on that stuff.
Yeah, I cannot give any good advice for like tricking.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just wondering, like, if you access the direct pixel already, like, quote unquote, whether it's actually really that or not, do you do operations on that? Does it keep climbing up in memory? I haven't really used Canvas that much, so I'm kind of curious.
What I've found is if I preload the page, even if they're just hidden elements, preload them as part of the DOM tree, you know what I mean?
Yeah, sure.
Then the fact that they're not being inserted dynamically seems to help out a lot.
I can believe
and
that.
just you writing to an existing object, then the browser seems to be a whole lot happier with that, rather than just simply trying to shoehorn a bunch of stuff in there, because then it just like seems to blow up how much RAM it needs to manage it all.
Maybe get you back?
Yeah, sure,
Yeah,
sure.
because we're getting sidetracked.
I know,
Yeah,
I just,
sorry.
I just thought if you have it.
It's getting late.
All right, so let me buzz through these two examples real quick. So Arqspin is a 360 photography platform that we've built. Basically, it's a way for people to use either like iPhone, iPads, or cameras to make these kinds of like interactive 360 visualizations. We focus both on let me pull up. Focus both on like museum applications. It's sort of where we do a lot of work on education stuff. So here's an example of like an app we've made that's using that tool. And then we also of course focus on like e-commerce, which is where we make money since the education doesn't make much money. So basically the like business model for this is we charge people monthly to handle their hosting costs, and we've built this framework that lets them create these things in a really like nice simple way, and then also edit them online, which is what I'm going to talk about. This other app, Focus Twist. Raise your hand if you know what this awkward object is. Like a fourth of the people. So this is a Litro camera. So it's a light field camera, which means that with one button, you take an image that you can refocus after the fact. This thing costs $400, so we decided to make like a $2 iPhone app that sort of gimmickly copies that effect. So let me first talk quickly about how in Arqspin we use. Just got a little checked out. Anyway, here's an example, slightly skewed, of how this thing looks online. It's a little crooked because I like to swap back and forth too fast. So let me show you really quickly, I hope. So here's a common operation we have people do. So they've taken this video of some shoe that they really like, but the background's not white. It's not like ready to put up on their website. So we created this web editor that basically lets people like do classic stuff, you know, just like contrast, brightness, things like this, to sort of get the, you know, do the color balancing that they need to make this thing ready to go. And then when they save it, we basically ship those editing parameters back to our server, and we crunch all of the JPEGs on our back end to get it ready for them to host, to like embed on their website. And so this thing, however, is all running in the browser. This is entirely JavaScript, HTML5. And so many people have come to ask, like, wait, how are you like doing crazy stuff with images on this thing? And I guess I'm going to show you that it's really not that hard. It's very simple, actually. After I copy and paste this into somewhere. All right, so readable.
Yeah, bigger.
Yeah, a little bigger. Yeah, pretty cool. All right, so this is the approach we take with this app using the Canvas element. So this is all JavaScript now, like erase your minds of Node.js. This is all running in the browser, Chrome, Firefox, whatever. So the way we do this is that we pick some refresh rate, in this case 30 hertz, and we do a set interval. So if you're not familiar in JavaScript, you call this, and it's going to call this function every, in this case, 30 hertz, whatever that is, 1,000 over 30 times a second. But this is calling this next frame function. This is doing some stuff for getting the object rotated. So basically we're saying, hey, your current position, add a little bit to that based on some speed parameter, which is affected by mouse movements. And then pick the index of the image that you're interested in showing. So imagine there's like this big array, let's say like 150 images. And so we're picking which image is supposed to be shown based on what you've been doing with the mouse. And then we call this paint function. And so this is basically the Canvas stuff. So let me, now that you've seen setup. So what I'm doing here is you get the context. So this is what you always have to do with a Canvas element if you're not familiar with it. You basically grab the element out of the DOM. That's what this does. In this case, this will be like Canvas ID equals C inside of your HTML. And so it grabs that element out of the DOM. It gets the 2D drawing context. And then we draw this image that we've loaded in the background. And one of the things that the .draw image lets you do is it lets you set a crop box. So I guess I can show the example of that. You can also sort of set crop dynamically if you need to like adjust the crop. So this is what lets you do that. And this is the width of the canvas in squares, so width and height. And now once you've put this image, this is the raw image, right? This is the junky image with the cruddy background. Once you've dropped that onto the canvas element, you can get the image data. So this is something that I think a lot of people don't realize about Canvas, is that you can get access to the raw pixels that are in your canvas. You can also do this with like video elements. So you can do this live while you're watching some video in like a HTML5 video element. You can do these kinds of operations where you like grab the pixels, process them really fast in JavaScript and splat them back to the screen. In this case, I'm basically like running through the data, getting some grayscale thing, and applying some color map to it. So we have some function that takes saturation, brightness, white point, and all these things, and produces the correct pixel value. So this is basically how that editor works in a nutshell. So this is, yeah.
Now all those Java images are already loaded in the browser. You're just
Yeah, well, there's some bootstrap code to like load all these things quickly, so that you don't have to like sit there and wait for 100 images to load. But it's pretty standard stuff. Basically, you just like get the sort. You basically like set callbacks on whenever one loads. Once it loads, it does the callback. Once the callback's been called, the right number of times, you say like, all right, let's go party.
What's the fewest number of images you recommend to achieve a decent effect?
For something like this, so we, it really depends what you want to do, I should say. I mean, some people are happy with 4, right? You just want left, right, front, back, or something. Or are you talking about like memory stuff, or? No,
actually, again, back to my business, the car dealers are going to take so many. I'm looking at possibly having them take pictures of their car by walking around a circle.
I'll give you my card. All right. So this is focus twist. So this is the sort of refocusable image. I hope maybe you can see that. Maybe you can't. But anyway, basically we accomplish this by, again, it's an iPhone app. You basically hold your phone still. We take a bunch of images while autofocus is freaking out. We actually take a video and then chop it up. And so then once we have that, we basically push all these to the back end. I'll say that, you already see what I'm saying. We push all these to the back end and we figure out in each image, sorry, not in each image, basically for each pixel, which image is most in focus. So this is kind of what we're representing on the right here. This is like, this image was most in focus, this most in focus, this most in focus, and so forth. So once we've done that, let me just show you the guts of this. This is how we get that interactive mouse. Basically, we do the interaction with the mouse. So in this case, focus key is what that image on the right is. It's basically just a very small image that has like 0 for index 0, 1 for index 1, and so forth. Once it loads, so we set onload to this and we load that. Once it's ready, we again grab the canvas element, get the context for it, and then we draw the image. In this case, we're basically putting that image in a canvas so that we can access the raw pixels. And then underneath is the draw canvas where we actually draw stuff. And I wanted to show this because this shows one other cool thing that you can do. In this case, the canvas, you can set sort of global drawing parameters on it. So here we're saying, hey, whenever I draw the canvas, draw it at 20% opacity. And then we do a set interval where we basically like look up the correct index based on where you've clicked, and we show that image, but we're showing it many times a second.
Oh, wow.
And so this is how you, I don't know if that impressive, but. So this is how you get this crossfade effect, right? You don't have to do any like crazy pixel processing. You just like draw, you're just always drawing to the canvas. You get a nice crossfade. You guys recognize this? Downtown Mall?
Yeah.
All right, so
is it your iPhone app that's creating that original depth map?
yeah, exactly. So the iPhone app actually does the capture. It's kind of hard. I need to stop.
But the iPhone app is capturing a number of frames, but it's also making that layer for you, those layers that you select from. Focusing,
yeah,
you doing
yeah.
that yourself.
Well, a common model in our business is that we find we have to do things both on the phone and then again on the server in order to avoid like moving a lot of data back and forth. So in this case, both the phone and the server. Basically, the phone does a quick and dirty thing that works pretty well in practice. On the server, we also like de-shake the frames. So you can imagine typically you're like trying to do this with your hand, but the frames aren't holding still, and so we do some like de-shaking, rerun that process.
What do you
like,
use for image processing on the server?
A bunch of C programs that I wrote in the night. Yeah.
How does that crossfading with the transitions work with IE8?
I have no idea. I don't care about being No, I'm kidding. IE8, it works fine. IE7 does not work at all.
No, I know. I don't. 7 is like a waste of time anyhow. But
Yeah,
there's still enough
IE8
people out there using 8.
supports most of the features of Canvas.
Yeah. Because I've tried
With
trickery,
trickery, not like the code I showed. You have to do some work. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so that's basically it for Canvas stuff. I'd be happy to give any, if anyone has questions about it, I'd be happy to talk more about it, but try to wrap up. who's in charge?
Yeah. Last time what we did was we took a break and then we had some lightning talks for anybody who wanted to go show something. So we could do that again. Unless something is a better idea. Yeah.
Breaks.
Yeah.
Break time.
Yeah. All right.
I'm part of the Room Key crew here. And by the way, I'm going to put on the obligatory plug. We're hiring. We're always hiring.
Please take a card.
And we do we basically use two languages here at Room Key. We use Clojure and we use JavaScript. And I guess there's maybe a smattering of others. Some of the ops guys use a little Python. I don't know. But they
Still be so Ruby knocks out.
yeah, I guess there's still a little bit of Ruby, isn't it? No? It's all gone?
It's all been burned.
So naturally, let me back up. Who knows more than just the name Clojure?
This much more.
This much more. All right, so nobody knows very much about Clojure. So let me talk very briefly about Clojure is a Lisp that is hosted on the JVM and
on the browser via JavaScript.
What's that?
And on the browser via JavaScript.
And on the browser, yes, via JavaScript, which is what Clojure script is. But let me talk a little bit about Clojure so I can set the stage for why we want to talk about Clojure script. Clojure is a Lisp host on the JVM. It is interesting in that it brings along sort of the maturity and the tool set and the support, all the stuff in the Java ecosystem that has been built over the last 20 years, which is really very mature and highly performant and all those other good kind of words. It's a Lisp, so it has all those nice properties that programmers like, where it's not statically typed, it's not a B&D, bondage and discipline kind of language. You can be very productive in it very quickly. It also has a couple of very special properties to us, mainly that it has immutable semantics, meaning that there's no assignment. There's no state in Clojure, essentially. So it's a language of pure functions, things that perform computations only, which is the opposite. It's sort of upside down from most other programming languages, where you assign x equal 1 or x equal foo all the time. Well, it's hard to do that. It's really hard to do that in Clojure, and that's on purpose, because it also has very rich support for concurrency. And when you mix concurrency and mutable state together, you get programs that don't work. So these things are sort of deliberately pulled apart, and that enables you to write concurrent code that actually runs and doesn't have a lot of bugs, which is why we like it. So, so we made the switch from Ruby to Clojure 3 years ago, sort of full on. And you were just saying we've exercised the last little bit of Ruby code for pure Clojure on the back end. Meanwhile, on the front end, we do JavaScript only in a single page app, and the API layer is what connects these two things together. So I'm a back-end programmer, sort of, that's my background, so I like Clojure for a lot of reasons, but I always felt like a fish swimming upstream when it came to doing anything on the front end. And not that I think JavaScript is a fine language, but it's just a whole bunch of more stuff to learn. And now that I've really grokked Clojure, I don't want to learn anything. So anyway, along comes this thing called Clojure Script, which allows you to do. Can you guys read this? Okay, should I make it bigger?
I'll probably make it a bit bigger.
Bigger. Is that better? Sorry about that. How's that? Beautiful. You guys can read that. Okay. So, this is not good. So this is code which is written in Clojure, so it's Lispy. There's lots of parentheses. If you see that second function down there where it's got a d/listenBang, what this is doing is setting up an event listener on a link in page. It's looking for a click event on a logout link, and it's associating a callback function to be fired when the link gets clicked. And so, like CoffeeScript, this is a way to write JavaScript without writing JavaScript. You write Clojure code. Clojure code is compiled on a JVM into JavaScript by way of Google's Clojure compiler, which also along the way does a lot of neat stuff like figure out what your dependencies are and pull in the right additional external JavaScript libraries and optimize the shit out of it and squeeze all the white space and blah, 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 blah. And you end up with, at the end of the day, having started with an artifact like this with the JavaScript file that you include on your web page, which looks like like any other piece of JavaScript you'd include. And you call a function in it, and away you go. That is probably more than 5 minutes already. So that's Clojure stuff.
The JavaScript, it gets
Yeah, okay, the JavaScript.
Do you want to look at the JavaScript?
Show it to us.
Yeah.
It's been through the whole transformation, right? Like the processor.
Okay.
He didn't,
not
he's
as
never
good.
been a fighter on.
Lots of stuff, right?
So anytime I see this, or even CoffeeScript, I wonder, like, how do you debug this? Like, what do you do when there's when something in your original, right? So, so you like it because you like Clojure already, and you want to be able to write JavaScript.
I should preface this by saying this is really immature in my view.
Really?
It's if wearing my architect's hat here at room key, I would say NFW. We're not using this; it's way too young. And anyway, we have a huge investment in a code base already that we're not going to toss out. If I were on a greenfields project under different circumstances, I might say, yeah, this is kind of interesting. But yeah, the tooling around this is really very young, and in particular, debugging is as awful as you can imagine it would be. Yeah.
Light table.
You've got some exception in the console, and you're like, what is in God's name? What is the relationship between this error and this piece of Clojure?
I know nothing about the particulars, but Light Table was originally a Clojure application. It's now Clojure script. The entire editor written completely in Clojure script. I know nothing about how they do it.
Wow.
Which really bugged the hell out of me because it was starting to get useful in Clojure, and they like threw it out.
And change the interface.
Started to go.
The thing about, I would say, CoffeeScript, I find the JavaScript generated by that pretty readable and very similar, where you can it's pretty easy to figure out where the matching kind of areas are. I'm not sure what gets generated here and how similar it is, but that's one of the reasons I feel like I can use CoffeeScript, is because I can still debug it sensibly without being like, it's just a mishmash of JavaScript.
Right. So you basically see like function name, you go look at that function name and you're like, I kind of see the relationship.
Yeah, it's actually really similar.
In terms of function names, when I've looked at generated JavaScript from ClojureScript, you can find the function, no problem.
Yeah.
It's just that it's unlike some of these other languages, it's a language that was very different semantics.
Yes.
Yeah, that's fine.
And so it's very...
You know approximately where the error is, you just don't know what it is.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you do with ClojureScript, I mean in Clojure, like everything's a function, like a proper function. Does it produce all proper functions?
Yes.
Interesting. So then what do you do when you have to get work done? Like,
What do you mean?
I don't know. It's so foreign to me. Like, so I mean, if you have to do some database stuff and you have to like save some state, this is.
That's what I originally asked. How do you save state?
Well, there's a couple of different ways we go about that. You could go about it in a ClojureScript native sort of way.
put all this together, so.
Those are the banks.
All the function of the banks, usually.
Or for
Changing
example,
like the DOM.
here's a little wrapper around local storage.
Do they follow that from Ruby or is it
You guys read that?
Yeah.
So here's just a little wrapper function, add just a little syntactic sugar on top of JavaScript, normal HTML5 semantics.
Okay.
Okay. But like most of that like image processing code you were talking about is just a pure function, right? The only stateful thing you have to do is swap out the canvas image.
So this is the big thing with making the transition to a language like this it's for me, and you guys, you guys can speak to this too. It involved for me throwing out more or less the last 20 years of my life and thinking about how I programmed and relearning it in a pure functional way. Super different. You don't write the code the same at all.
Right.
But all the places that you think in your head that you need state, like not all, 99% of them, you don't.
Right.
Did you look at other functional languages backend before?
No, before we made the switch, I looked principally at Scala and Go, which was 2.5 years ago now, so they were at a different place than they are now, for sure. But neither of them seemed like a good fit.
Did you look at Haskell?
Look at what? Haskell, did you say?
Did you wiggle the extra?
What was that?
I kind of like eased into it because I started out with C and then C++, and then I kind of I started writing Python from there. So for a while I wrote Python to look like C, and then I learned about all the other features of Python, like list comprehensions and all this stuff that's kind of like functional-esque.
Yeah.
So I sort of eased my way into it over a decade. So.
A couple more plugs for the language or both the languages, but maybe Tom, you could speak to this too. But I would say roughly our line count dropped in half, maybe a third as much as the previous code, which was written in Ruby. And Ruby, as you guys probably know, is a pretty expressive, pretty concise language to begin with. So Clojure code is very dense, which is good because the amount of state you have to hold in your head is, finite. So, anyway. That's it. That's my 5-minute talk.
Can I take another question?
Yeah.
So, is there any inherent value in thinking in terms of the functional approach on the front end side?
On the front end?
Because if you've got the concurrency on the back end, I'm not sure it really applies to the side of the project. Is it mostly just the layer, the layering of the language, translating so that you can?
I think for me personally, that's where I'm coming at it from my own point of view right now. Is thinking, is it possible for me to write front-end code? And I think the answer is yes, using tooling like this, without having to do a whole lot of more learning.
So what happens when you pull in non-functional libraries?
Well, you saw in that little example there, the interop is the syntax for the interop is very straightforward. I guess it would be interesting to see. I haven't run into a place where I'm using an external library that I need to keep state for.
I mean, Clojure deals with Java all the time.
Deals with Java all the
Like, it's already got that built into how it handles that non-functional sort of library system.
Yeah. Although most of the interop we do is talking like wrappers around Java clients for external services or databases.
Yeah.
So already you know that state is being set or done there. And then the other one is like certain kind of time sort of utility libraries like the time library. And most of those are actually just pure functions, right? It's just, create a data object that's now, which is kind of like a bit of state, and then instantly format it or something, which is just a pure function. Or take one that you've made before and format it some way, or add a date or whatever. But all like the static methods on all these things are basically just pure functions. So
I guess to come back around to your question a little bit, though, JavaScript is already a functional language, right?
Yeah. It's almost the personalities.
Yeah. Exactly.
But it really is functional. Yeah. Just not. It's really functional.
Purely functional.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's an interesting project called Pedestal. It's really young. It's like a
Pedestal?
Yeah, it's a closure/closure script kind of framework for web apps. Pedestal.
What? I didn't catch the word closure.
Closure/closure script.
Oh.
It's a closure and closure script framework for making web apps.
It's like a full stack framework.
Full stack, yeah. And basically, it's very young, but it's pitched for ClojureScript on the front end. Basically, it divorces the way it updates the front end. Is that you write a bunch of pure functions that make events that change the model on the front end. So testing becomes very easy because you say, when this click function happens, I'm going to spew out all these events. And basically it's a pure function. And you can test that, wherever you want. And then you just have to make sure that you set the DOM model up so that when those events come in, it changes the right things around. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting idea. It's worth it.
It's also, it's super young.
It's super
brand
young.
new.
Yeah. But that is an interesting idea. Like testing would become a lot easier. Testing the front would become a lot easier if that actually.
Sounds
get your head around that.
similar. I haven't used it, but it sounds similar to Bacon.js, which is a JavaScript library which thinks of things in streams on the front end. So, you have a click handler, and then it streams with events through other transformations. And, but it sounds similar to kind of what you're talking about. Again, I haven't used it.
There's so many .js.
Just also cutting edge. Nobody knows what they're doing. Yes.
So is every JavaScript library required to have JS in it?
It seems like the new trend, yeah. It's like every website has to end in LY now, right? So
every what now?
Every Apple product has
I
to
don't
begin
know,
with I.
yeah, parsley.
Oh, right.
And for a while, everything from Microsoft had to end with X.
Exactly.
Has anyone used that other library, Vertalex or whatever, the other framework?
I'm sorry?
Vertalex is isn't it like a groovy kind of Node.js thing?
Yeah, I think it's like going to be the big Node.js competitor.
Yeah,
I think
it's Node.js on the JVM.
Yeah.
That's
So your JVM junkies will love it. So, I think it might trump Node.js once it gets its feet under it and really gets moving, because it basically can do everything Node.js can, but it also accommodates all these JVM languages. So
and JVM libraries.
Yeah, which is a lot of people are.
So
yeah.
I'm sorry, what was the name again?
It's called Vert.x.
Vert.x.
So VERT.x.
It's been around for a little while now.
Yeah, it doesn't quite have the foaming at the mouth crazy JavaScript people that Node.js does, but it'll definitely something to keep an eye on for sure.
Cool.
Should we call it a wrap?
Yeah.
It seems like that's the.
Yeah. Well, next time we have to
That's all I have to
say.
workshop, but does anybody have any ideas for what they want to see, upcoming?
What did you say was next?
Yeah, how about
What did you
workshops?
say was next time?
Okay.
Next one's an Angular workshop.
Propose that we do like an interview by workshop comparison.
Oh, yeah. Shoot out.
Oh, that'd be good.
I'd love to see that.
So we've already got him and Emacs stacks together.
Yeah.
I'm all about Sublime Text too, so I could definitely talk about Sublime Text too.
All right.
Come on, Emacs VI, really, guys?
Pico!
That's like 30 years ago. 20 years ago.
What? Troll! Troll! Copy Kong!
I have a troll costume, I'll wear it. Yeah, it's showdown. Run down.
Cats, bro. I didn't know that shit.
But now we have it all connected.
That's pretty good.
So, all right, put that on the calendar.
Yeah.
So next one's not a talk.